All right, so today we're going to be solving another paper 3, so A2 Economics MCQ paper, May, June 2018, variant 2. And let's jump straight into it. If you have any additional questions regarding any particular MCQ's explanation, feel free to ask in the comments below. You can also suggest specific papers you want me to solve, and I'll try to do so. All right, so how is social cost calculated? What you should know that social cost is the sum of private cost plus negative externalities or external cost to third-party actors, and that will simply give you external cost plus private cost. So relatively simple MCQ. Question 2 is which government policy is not, this is important, not aimed at correcting inefficiency in resource allocation. The first is marginal cost pricing in state-owned industries. I'm not going to go in depth behind the theory of this, but marginal cost pricing, where price is equals to MC, is something you should know when solving MCQ past papers for economics. That is where firms achieve allocative efficiency. So clearly, if you do have marginal cost pricing, you are helping in resource allocation and reducing inefficiency there. So that doesn't fit in the ambit of the not aspect of the question. Permits restricting pollution of rivers by private firms. That is indeed important because you are restricting such pollution, because otherwise if you allow firms to allocate in such a way and produce in such a way where they are polluting rivers, that will lead to external costs, and that's not a socially optimum level of output or mechanism of production. So if you do have permits restricting this, that's a good thing that will reduce inefficiency in resource allocation. So the not aspect is not fulfilled. Requiring firms to pay a minimum wage does not help in resource. This is not, because it's something. Part B was something that helps correct inefficiency, so it doesn't fulfill the not aspect of the question. Part C is an answer, because requiring firms to pay a minimum wage, while that is good from a social perspective and from the perspective of the laborers, it in no way helps us achieve allocative efficiency or helps contain external costs or things of that sort, and thus that is be the odd one out. That'll be our answer. Part D we can also cross out, because the provision of public goods at zero price, so goods like street lights and things of that sort, goods which are non-rival and non-excludable, are important. The provision of those goods helps us achieve outputs which are more socially optimal, and thus helps us improve resource allocation. Let's go on to question 3. The table shows some of the costs and benefits in dollar millions associated with a road building project. Both a government department and a profit maximizing firm are considering building the road. Here are some of the numbers. Who would be willing to build the road? Now, what you should know is that for the government department, it's going to be looking at social benefits and social cost. And the social benefit should be greater than the social cost for it to be worthwhile, because only then it will be beneficial on net. For a profit maximizing private firm, they don't unfortunately give too many hoots about negative externalities or external costs or external benefits. So they're only going to care if the private benefit is greater than the private cost. Now, let's do the profit maximizing firm's case first. You do have private costs. You unfortunately don't have your private benefit. So how do you compare that? However, we do know that social benefit is private benefit plus external benefit. And thus, we do know social benefits, we do know external benefits, so we can calculate private benefits. That would simply be private benefit would then be social benefit minus external benefit. If you pop that in, social benefit here is for this project is 550, external benefit is 50. So your private benefit is 50, and your private cost, it's 500. 550 minus 550 is 500, and your private cost is 450. So clearly, for a private firm which only cares about private benefit and private cost, the private benefit is greater than the private cost. So the private firm would be okay with going on with this project. If you now look at the government, we have social benefit. We do not have social cost, but we know social cost is equals to private cost plus external cost. And we have those particular values. So private costs are just 450, like $1 million. So maybe not just 450, and external costs are 75. So that leaves you with a nice value of 525. You can use your calculator. And social benefits are given in the information, that is 550. So still social benefit is greater than social cost. Compare these two values. So the government department would also be willing to go ahead with the project. So both would be willing to build it. 3A would be your answer. Question 4. In the diagram, Q1 is the quantity produced of a good as the result of market forces. So this is your intersection. This is your equilibrium point, and this is the quantity you're producing. And naturally, it's where supply intersects with demand, and we don't care about the supply which is taking into account which is referring to the social cost, because that takes into account the negative externalities. It's only taking into account private cost, which is what will happen because the market only cares about private benefit and private cost. So we're not looking at the external cost or the negative externalities that are associated with this product. If we were, we'd be producing here, so a lot less, but we're not. So which concept is presented in output Q1? No, it's not a government subsidy. If anything, a government subsidy would shift supply towards the right because it would increase supply by lowering cost. It is a negative externality, as already extensively discussed here. It's not a positive externality because social costs are greater than private costs, which imply that there's an external cost also associated. So a positive externality, for that we require some information regarding social benefit and a private benefit. We don't have that, so we can't go ahead with this. It's definitely not a specific tax. This is not a supply curve of a tax to begin with, but even if it was, the fact that it's not a parallel shift, it's a shift which diverges outwards. If this was a diagram showing the tax, it would be an ad valorem tax, which is a tax rate which is a percentage of the price, not just like a specific value that's always added to every single price point. But anyways, just you look at the fact that social cost is greater than private cost, there exists a negative externality, and you can just go ahead with B. You don't have to think too much about the other options. Question 5. What would not affect the budget line of an individual consumer? So if you recall, if you have good X and good Y, this is your budget line, which basically the gradient of the budget line is minus Px upon Py. So it shows the ratio of prices. And what you should also remember from theory is that the budget line has parallel shifts outwards and inwards if your income variable changes. Because if your income increases, you can buy more of X and Y at the same price. If your income decreases, you can buy less, and so on. There are pivoted shifts if your gradient changes, which is where the prices of some of the products change. So we're saying what would not affect the budget line. An individual's preference for various goods would not affect it, because an individual's preference would affect the utility that they associate with various goods. So maybe they associate more utility with good X, but that would affect the indifference curve, which shows utility, not your budget constraint or your budget line. The level of income tax would affect your budget line, which is why it's not the answer. Because if you have higher tax, the disposable income decreases. So your income decreases, and that will shift the budget line inwards, or the reverse if you have lower tax. The money prices of the goods will change your gradient, and thus will have a pivoted shift in the budget line. And the wages earned by the individual will also increase or decrease your income depending on whether wages are increasing or decreasing. Let's go on to question 6. The diagram shows the demand curve for a product. What is maximized at X? So what is maximized when you start producing OX quantity at essentially zero price? Marginal revenue. Not really. What you should know that the demand curve is also the average revenue curve, and the marginal revenue curve falls twice as fast, so it has double the gradient, and this is your marginal revenue curve. So your marginal revenue, if you're producing this, is actually is going to go on into negative. So your marginal revenue is going to be negative at this point. It's definitely not going to be maximized. It would have been maximized here. Your total revenue, you should know that the total revenue is maximized when MR is equal to 0. There are two ways to understand this. The first way is a little more mathy for people who are doing A-level math as well and have done differentiation, that uh, the MR is the gradient of the total revenue. And thus, when the gradient is equal to 0, that's the maximum point because it's a stationary point. That's one way to understand it. The second way, which is perhaps hopefully simpler to understand why the total revenue is maximized when MR is equal to 0, is because just if you look at this, wherever MR is in the positive region, every unit has some positive marginal revenue associated. So it's always adding to your total revenue. That stops when MR is equal to 0. After that, it's in the negative region. So every unit is having a negative MR. So it's going to decrease your total revenue. So the maximum point will come when MR is equal to 0, because before that, it's all increased. So you can keep increasing. And then that's the final point. After that, if you increase, you're just going to decrease total revenue. Point being that total revenue will be maximized at this point, not at this point, which is the point X that we're actually looking at. Let's just use a slightly different color because it's getting a little messy. Marginal utility. You should recall the law of diminishing marginal utility, which essentially states that the more you buy of something, the marginal utility decreases because you just have less satisfaction with every additional unit you buy. And here you're buying a lot of units, so clearly this is not where your marginal utility would be. As you can say, clearly this is not where your marginal utility would be maximized. This is where your total utility will be maximized, because before this, at every particular point, you had some marginal utility associated with it, associated with the product, which is why you were willing to pay a price. But at this point, the marginal utility is equal to 0. So for the same reason, an explanation as to why the total revenue is maximized when MR is equal to 0, the total utility is maximized when MU is equal to 0. And by that logic, you can go with 60. Question 7. The diagram shows the firm's cost and revenue curves. This is the infamous and very oddly sounding kinked demand curve. And what you should know, this happens in the oligopoly, whatever, excuse my spelling, but the oligopoly market structure. And the reason for that is because if you decrease price, all your other rivals also decrease price because they're interdependent. You're all interdependent, and thus you don't really benefit from as much, like in terms of your profit, which is why for MR, whether you irrespective whichever your MR is going to be the same here. So if you decrease price, you don't have an increase in the MR. So you'll be producing at this point because where MC is equals to MR at this quantity as it's already shown. But anyhow, let's look at the options. Which features are associated with the diagram? Economies of scale. For that, you'll need your average cost curve, which you don't have. And you'll have to see how it's, as you produce more and more, how your average cost is decreasing. So you can just cross this out. Interdependence, which is true because it is an oligopoly structure where you do have interdependence, but not allocative efficiency. It will be allocative efficiency if you were pricing at marginal, if your price, i.e. your AR or your demand curve, was equals to marginal cost. That would be here. That's where you will be allocatively efficient, but you're not doing that, so you aren't allocatively efficient. It is price rigidity because that also happens in an oligopoly structure. And the reasoning for price rigidity is simple, that because your MR is the same here, that's why through this particular position, you don't really, so to speak, it doesn't really affect you whether you keep your price here, you keep your price here, keep your price here, keep your price here. The output's still the same, so you're still meeting your MC and you're intersecting with it here. So this gap in the MR leads to some rigidity in price at this particular level, simply because irrespective of whether you keep your price here, the output would still be the same. So you just rather want to keep it high on the higher end, because that's still going to achieve your profit maximizing level of output. The output will remain the same. So price rigidity does exist. Economies of scale doesn't for the previous explanation. And thus you have price rigidity and interdependence as explained before. Question 8. In the year ending July 2016, airline fuel prices fell by 20.4%. So this is falling. And the price of passenger aircrafts increased by 1.1%. So this is increasing. And assuming no other changes, we have to look at fixed costs and variable costs. So airline fuel prices should be variable costs because it depends on the amount of output. So the amount of planes you're going to be flying, the amount of flights you will have, that will affect how much of fuel you consume, how much of fuel you buy in the first place. So this is one of your variable cost, and we've clearly identified that it's decreasing. So variable costs have to decrease. Passenger aircraft is a fixed cost. Like once you, it's the cost of buying a plane. So irrespective of how many times you fly the plane, how many flights you have, whether it's COVID and you're not having any flights, it's still a cost. It's just going to exist and it's independent of output. So it's a fixed cost. And we know that this is increasing. This has increased. So 8C. Which feature of production which would make it more likely that an industry is a contestable market? Now, a contestable market is very similar to a competitive market in the way it behaves, but it's slightly different for one reason. So contestable market is largely characterized by the fact it has very low barriers to entry. So what you're looking for in these options are low barriers to entry, which then put the pressure, put the fear that there could be competitions. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are low barriers to entry, but the difference is there's actually is a lot of competition in the market. So there exists lots of competition in the market due to low barriers to entry. In a contestable market, there doesn't necessarily exist competition in the market right now, but because there are low barriers to entry, there exists the fear or the threat that there could be competition in the market later on, which is why you still behave similar to a competitive firm if you're in the market. So there's a slight difference between actual competition existing and the fear that competition can easily come in because there are low barriers to entry, which differentiates competitive and contestable markets. If advertising has established consumer loyalty, then you won't be fearful of competition, so it won't be a contestable market. All firms in the industry share research and development. I suppose that's great, but if all firms in the industry share research and development, does that induce fear of new firms entering? That doesn't really identify the main thing behind contestable markets, which is low barriers to entry. So we can cross this out as well. Low fixed costs, so like low fixed costs in terms of low cost of setting up a factory or low cost of starting production. If those are low, then that lowers the barrier to entry because the biggest barrier to entry is the fixed cost. So the initial cost that you have to suffer even when you're not producing anything. So if you have low fixed costs, that's great. That implies low barriers to entry, and thus your market is contestable. And if market rivals aim to reduce product differentiation, this seems more like a case if you have market rivals, that's more of a comparative market rather than a contestable market, which I explained previously. What is an example of backward vertical integration? So vertical integration is integrating along the line of production rather than and like integrating vertically. So either going forward, which is towards the finished good, or going backward, which is towards the raw material. So a bakery buying a wheat farm is backward vertical integration because it's the same production line. So a wheat farm, like wheat is produced, then it goes to the bakery, then a bakery bakes nice stuff from it. So it is vertical. It's backward because it's going from the finished good back to the raw material. So that's the backward aspect. A car manufacturer buying a car showroom is vertical, but it's forward because it's going from manufacturer, which is closer to your like unfinished good, you could say, to your finished good. Vineyard buying an apple orchard is just like it's just probably a conglomerate because they're two completely different things. And two rival supermarkets joined together is horizontal, not vertical integration because they're both in the same stage of production and they're both in the same industry and they're just joining each other. The diagram shows a firm in imperfect competition. So monopolistic competition is something you could be thinking of. It changes its aim from profit maximization, which is MR is equals to MC is what you should be producing at profit maximization, uh, to sales revenue maximization. We already discussed before, sales revenue maximization is basically maximizing total revenue, and that occurs, we've explained why previously in the paper, when MR is equals to 0. So let's identify what's going on here. And they've basically asked us the type of profit. So let's look at it. Firstly, you had MR is equals to MC. This was your level of output. And this was your average cost. This was your average revenue. So clearly, this much amount is like, the per unit super normal profit you're making. So it's normal profit if AC is equals to AR, and it's super normal profit if average revenue is greater than average cost. So when it was profit maximizing, it was making super normal profit. Now let's look at when it's changed to sales revenue maximization. Sales revenue maximization is when MR is equal to 0. So this Q1. This is your average cost, and this is your average revenue, looking at this curve. So you still have some amount of profit, a supernormal profit. It's a little less than before, but at the end of the day, AR is still equal greater than AC, so that's still supernormal profit. So not this, you're making supernormal profit, and thus the answer is D. An airline sells seats at $100 each 3 months before a flight, 150 each 1 month before a flight, and 200 each the day before a flight. What describes this type of market behavior by the firm? This is straight up textbook price discrimination. Price discrimination is where you're charging different consumers different prices, importantly, for the same product. So if you're charging higher prices for business class as opposed to economy class, that's not price discrimination because the service is different, right? Business class gives you more than economy class. So charging different prices there is not price discrimination. Here, though, for the same seats, you're charging less to someone who books in advance, more to someone who books later. But the service is still the same. The service is still the seat on the same plane, and no difference in class. Thus, this is price discrimination. So, like we're not fully sure whether it's a monopoly supplier or not. But since this is the only price discrimination option, and price discrimination usually does occur, but by monopoly suppliers, because only they have the power to do this in most cases, you can pick option B. Limit pricing is essentially pricing low to deter entry into a market, but this is not what's happening here. They're in fact hiking up the prices. Price leadership happens in an oligopolist or an oligopoly market structure, where the market leader sets the price and the rest follow. That's not what's happening here. And where price equals average cost under perfect competition is not what's happening here. We have nothing in the question to believe this is a perfectly competitive industry. If it was, then you probably wouldn't be so easily increasing your prices anyways. So let's change to a color which I like a little more. Question 13. What would not be an indication of a divergence between the interests of the managers and shareholders of a company? So this is your principal agent problem. So your principal is your shareholders, and the agents that they hire to take care of their money and like to run the firm and all are their managers. So a divergence in interest is like when they have different interests, and thus the problem is created. And we're saying, when would this not happen? So an emphasis on sales maximization would be a divergence of interest. Managers might want to maximize sales to get more money. Usually their salaries are tied to the amount of revenue or sales, but shareholders care about profits. So the interests are diverging, they are different. Management salaries, which are linked to the long run growth of the company's share price. This is where there isn't divergence because they are shareholders, they care about the share price because that will affect the dividends they make, so the profit they will make. And if management salaries are also linked to the share price, it will affect the manager's salaries as well. So they will also care about maximizing profit and influencing the share price in a positive way. So both of them have the same interest then to influence the share price. So that's fine. I don't wait. Why did I cross this? This would not be an indication. Oh, whoops. My my slide apologies. I forgot there's a not. So we're looking for where there's not an indication of a divergence, and this is a divergence, and this is not a divergence because this is where they're both one and the same. Yeah. So we were fine throughout. The acceptance of X inefficiency. X inefficiency is where you don't have incentives or you're just not trying to minimize cost at that particular point of output. So if this is your average cost curve, this point would be productive efficiency. Or if you're somewhere else, that would be productively inefficient because you want to get onto minimum average cost. X inefficiency is just like for any particular output. If you're not being on the minimum possible average cost for that specific output, you're producing somewhere here, then you're being X inefficient. So the acceptance of this is a divergence because the managers are unlikely to care. It doesn't affect their salary, but the shareholders will care because it affects their profits. And purchasing artwork for the company's headquarters, the managers might like having some nice art to look at. The shareholders won't appreciate it because well, it's money out of their pockets. It's like going to affect the profit margin, so they're not going to like it. So that is a divergence of interest. The total cost to a school of employing 10 cleaners is 60,000 per hour. So this is your total cost. So the cost per cleaner, or rather the wage, is $6. Oh God, why can't I draw? All right, this is $6 because 10 cleaners, $60 is the overall cost. So 60 divided by 10 is 6. The school estimates that the hourly marginal cost of employing an 11th cleaner would be $11.5. So that would be your marginal cost. And by how much would the hourly wage have to increase to employ the additional cleaner? Now you should recall the formula. Marginal cost is your new total cost minus your old total cost. So now what do we know? We know that the marginal cost is 11.5, so let's input that. What's the new total cost? We don't really know this. We know that there is a particular wage and that will be multiplied by 11 because there are now 11 cleaners. That's the new total cost. The old total cost is 60 as given here because there were 10 cleaners at a wage of $60 of $6 per cleaner, so that's 60. Then you can manipulate this 11.5 plus 60, that just goes there, and then you can divide 11 as well, giving you wage. And if I quickly pop this into my calculator, because I am not that good at mental math, that gives us a wage equals to 6.5 $6.5. So like, don't get confused and pick this or anything. The old wage was $6. The new wage now has to be $6.5. So the difference, the increase, is $0.5, which is A. What would cause a rise in the productivity of labor? An increase in indirect taxes would it would rise the price. I'm unsure how it affects the productivity of labor because it's just taxes on the sale of the product. An increase in the quality of capital definitely would increase the productivity of labor. Capitals includes your machines, all of the things you use to produce other things, your tools. So if you have better tools and machines, clearly the same labor can produce more, right? So the same amount of labor can produce more. That's a rise in productivity. A rise in consumer surplus, that depends. If a rise in productivity can allow the producer to reduce price and thus increase consumer surplus, but it doesn't necessarily mean. Um, oh, sorry. You can cross this out because it's asked what would cause a rise in the productivity of labor. So this definitely would not cause it. And lastly, you can look at a rise in the elasticity of the supply of labor. If there's more elasticity of the supply of labor, that essentially just means that for small changes in wage, so if wage decreases by a bit, the supply of labor would decrease by a lot. So it would have a larger than proportionate effect. That has nothing to do with the productivity of labor, it's just the supply of labor. So you can cross that out as well. Right. Let's move on to the next question. All right, where were we? We were on question 16, so let's proceed with that. D1 and S are initial demand and supply curves for building workers, and then demand for building workers rises to D2. How much is economic rent earned of building workers rise? So let's analyze economic rent at the first point, which is where T was the wage and V was a quantity of labor. What you should know uh, is that all of this stuff, so below the supply curve, all of this are your transfer earnings. Your transfer earnings are the minimum amount that is required for to be paid such that you remain in this particular industry's job market, labor market rather. So it's your opportunity cost of working this job. So that's denoted by all of these points of the supply curve. So all of this area under your the supply curve indicates your transfer earnings, and conversely, the area below the wage but above the supply curve indicates your economic rent. Let's just call that ER. Now, if you look at here, this is the new wage that has come about, wage U, and now you're producing quantity of labor. So now the quantity of labor available that's being hired is W because of the increase in demand. So this would be the increase in your transfer earnings, but this would be the increase in your economic rent because this area is the additional area that is below the wage but above the supply curve. So now this has been added onto your economic rent. This is going to be TUZX. It's gone really messy, so my apologies, but hopefully the concept and the reasoning was clear. Under which circumstances will a subsidy from the government be most beneficial if there are externalities from producing good X? So the externality clearly has to be positive because a subsidy encourages production, it lowers costs of production and encourages the producer to supply more and produce more. So you want production of positive subsidies, positive externality based goods to increase. You don't want to encourage the production of negative of goods which have negative externalities. So now you have elasticity. Less than 1 is inelastic. As you study in your AS, greater than 1 is elastic. So which one helps you more? And the answer is elastic. Let's quickly explain why. The reason here is because what a subsidy essentially does is it reduces your cost of production and thus increases supply, right? And an increase in supply always, or mostly, decreases price. You can quick diagram will tell you supply, demand. If you what on earth? My bad. Really need to get some sleep. Demand and supply, complete opposite. So if you increase supply, it goes to the right. Clearly, you can see the price decreases. So point being, price will decrease. Now, what does PED tell you? It tells you a relationship between price of the product and quantity demanded, so the quantity that will be consumed. The reason why, if it's elastic, it's good because even a small decrease in price would lead to a larger than proportionate increase in quantity demanded. So the goal of having more of that product, that good product which has positive externalities consumed, that goal is better achieved. Instead, if you went with the inelastic option, that won't be achieved because a decrease in price will lead to a less than proportionate increase in quantity demanded. So you wouldn't get as many people consuming that product. That product wouldn't be as much as produced, and thus the goal of having more of products being consumed which have positive externalities would not be achieved. 18. Which tax would help a government achieve a more equal distribution of income after the tax? So you want a more equal distribution of income, and usually this means you want to hit the rich a little harder with the tax and give some leeway to the poor. Only then can you somewhat normalize income. Emphasis on the somewhat. A constant rate sales tax applicable to all goods and services. Sales taxes you should know are regressive, and that means that they affect the poor more, because the rich only spend a small fraction of their money buying stuff, and from that you'll only have a certain amount of sales tax, so it won't affect them that much. But for a poor person, your MPC is higher. You're going to spend most of your money buying stuff because you need to buy stuff to just to sustain yourself, basic food stuff, and thus a sales tax would hurt the poor person more if you look at the percentage wise how much the poor person is affected. So this is not something, this would increase or widen inequality, not decrease it. A constant rate tax per person might seem nice, but again, uh, even if it's a constant 10%, the rich person can afford to pay 10% and still have lots of money after that. The poor person would be hurt a lot more by that 10% tax, and you won't achieve the idea of equal distribution of income or getting closer to that by just a constant rate tax per person. An income tax with a constant marginal rate over the whole income range. The same logic here. It would just, even though it's a constant marginal rate and it applies to both the poor and the rich, it doesn't help you achieve a more equal distribution of income. For that, you need to favor the poor a bit, give them some leeways, and then tax the rich a little harsher. So an income tax with a tax-free allowance, so that usually means that if you are below a certain income level and you're poor, you don't have to pay tax. So that's good because it helps the poor, and a constant marginal rate thereafter. So it would have been better even if this had been progressive. So the marginal rate would have kept increasing as the income bracket increased. But this is definitely the best option we have because it still gives some leeway to the poor. So it's not going to tax them at the very least below a certain level of income, and it's going to tax people who are above the certain level of income, and that will help us achieve somewhat more equality. 19. A country has a population of 100 million. There are 5 million people unemployed, and the country has an employment rate of 10%. What is the size of the labor force? Now, what you should know is that your unemployment percentage is the number of people that are unemployed. So, how many people are unemployed divided by your labor force. So, let's try to use this particular formula. We know the unemployment rate is 10%. Please don't write 10. It's 10%, which means 10 divided by 100. So that's 0.1. Like with percentages 10, you don't just pop in 10 here. You write 0.1. It's 10 divided by 100 because it's a percentage. The number of unemployed are 5 million, and the labor force is unknown. So you take the labor force here, which leaves you with labor force is equals to 5 million upon 0.1. You can pop that into your calculator, but some of you are good at a little quick math. You should know that it is 50 million. So the labor force is 50 million. The labor force are the number of people which are willing and able to work. So naturally, in a country of 100 million, not everyone will be willing and able to work. There will be young children, there will be the elderly, there will be people who aren't just looking for jobs, so on and so forth. Which type of unemployment is correctly linked to the description of its cause? So cyclical unemployment occurs due to changes in the aggregate demand overall, so across all goods and services because it's aggregate demand, due to swings in the business cycle. So that this occurs due to recession and due to growth and booms, so inflationary and deflationary pressures, stuff like that. A change in demand due to holiday periods is seasonal unemployment. It's not. It does this. I do understand some people might get confused with this because there's still a cycle because there are some holiday periods, there are some not. But this cyclical unemployment is linked to just things like recession, things like positive output gaps, not necessarily holiday periods, and thus you can cross this out. Frictional unemployment is caused due to people looking for jobs or people unwilling to work in the short-term temporary period. So stuff like that. And it is caused by a lack of sufficient information. It's caused by other factors as well, but it's also a lack of sufficient information because people are between jobs or looking for jobs, but they don't find the right job for them, or they don't find an employer who's hiring because there isn't as much information as required. Structural unemployment is what occurs when the country's economy is changing. So some industries will face a decrease in employment, some will face an increase in employment. So, for example, some structural unemployment has happened to some manufacturing industries because there's been a shift away from some type of products, or there are different regulations, and that's what we're looking at. And this says a temporary change in the consumer's expenditure, so it's not matching that description at all. Technological unemployment is quite self-explanatory. It's just if new technology makes old tasks and workers redundant because you don't need them anymore. And this says a general decrease in the demand for goods, so this is not true either. This would be cyclical, in fact. Growth rates can be calculated using changes in the value of GDP from year to year. Why is real GDP per head considered to be a better indicator than nominal GDP per head? And the reason essentially is because real takes into account inflation. And you need to take into account inflation, because otherwise, if nominal GDP doesn't take that into account, you could see a higher GDP value because the market prices have risen. But that rise is not due to the fact that you're producing more. That rise is just due to the fact that you had higher prices, so you had inflation. So real GDP is the better way to go. And that's what option A says: real GDP adjusts for price changes using a base year. Real GDP ignores the effects of fluctuations in exchange rates on purchasing power. I'm pretty sure nominal does that, ignores that as well. Real GDP includes changes in the size of the population. Both of them are per head. Both of them are per head. So both of them are per person. So that's not a differentiating factor. And real GDP does not imply that it measures GDP at factor cost than market prices. That would take into account things like taxation and subsidy, but that's not what real GDP implies. What would not exist in a free market, open economy? So open to trade, no protectionism. Autonomous investment would exist. People can invest autonomously by themselves as well. It's not something that would be regulated at all, because in the free market, you don't really have meaningful government regulation. In a free market, people can still save. Households can still save. They will still save for normal reasons. Import spending would exist. I mean, it's an open economy. You can import all you want. Indirect taxation wouldn't exist because taxation is implemented by the government, and it's a free market economy, so the government isn't playing a particular role here. All right, so let's move on to question 23. So question 23 says that the information in the table is taken from a country's national income accounts. You have some information, you have to calculate the value of national income. So here the income-based approach would be useful. So wages should be included, salary should be included. The only two things you won't include are unemployment benefits and pensions. So wages are included because you're giving income for the laborer's work that helps in production. Same logic with salaries. Rent is being earned by those who have leased out their capital goods. Interest is being earned by those who leased out their capital goods, and rent is being earned by another factor of production as well, which is land. These two are not factors of production. These are simply transfer payments. So they are not income payments. They're transfer payments, which are payments provided for which no subsequent good or service is provided. So the unemployed don't give you anything. You just give them benefits for humanitarian purposes. Similar logic for pensions as well. So just cross these two out, add the rest. So this is 15, 18, 20. What is part of Keynesian economic analysis? So the quick hack, grossly oversimplifying it, but what Keynes loves and what examiners love to give is just think of Keynes as this dude which really likes fiscal policy. So really likes stimulating the economy through taxation and government expenditure, and does not so much like monetary policy, and can occasionally you'll get options like the one you have here, where dissing monetary policy in a way. So option A says a liquidity trap below which interest rates are ineffective, and here what the implication is that when the liquidity trap occurs, monetary policy doesn't really work because increasing money supply or decreasing interest rates, the decrease of interest rates doesn't really happen. So the monetary policy is ineffective here. So this is part of your Keynesian economic analysis, because part of Keynesian economic analysis is stuff as to why fiscal policy is great, but it's also stuff as to why monetary policy is not so great. So this is the critique of monetary policy. It's part of the Keynesian economic analysis. An equilibrium price, which always clears the market, it's part of your free market analysis, which is not necessarily what Keynes was talking about. A small value for the government expenditure multiplier, not a small value. Keynes did believe in fiscal policy, did believe in increasing government expenditure, and believed that that would stimulate the economy. So that would have a large multiplier, not a small one, and not a vertical shortened aggregate supply curve. If you don't remember this from your notes, you can simply look at it like this. If you have price level and you have some measure of output here, and you have a vertical shortened aggregate supply curve, in that scenario, increasing aggregate demand won't help. Increasing aggregate demand will simply cause inflation, demand pull inflation, my apologies, without increasing your national income or your output. So the belief of a vertical shortened aggregate supply curve are those is a belief of people who critique or who aren't fully on board with fiscal policies or policies which would necessarily increase aggregate demand, because they feel that that won't really help, that will just lead to inflation. But Keynes is on board with fiscal policies and thus increasing aggregate demand. So clearly, he wouldn't say, yeah, there's a vertical shortened aggregate supply curve. What will definitely, so conclusively, increase a country's gross national product, so the product that's being produced by people within the country, an increase in income taxes. An increase in income taxes would not increase your gross national product. If you tax more, there's less disposable income, there's less consumption, your aggregate demand and your production just goes down. An increase in the marginal propensity to import. Well, if you have a higher propensity to import, you will be importing more, which will decrease aggregate demand, so less production. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And increase in the value of a country's currency. Now, this is still ambiguous. So, if a country's currency increases, that could increase exports if your the elasticity of demand of your exports is inelastic. It could decrease exports if the elasticity is elastic. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but the point being, this is not a definite. The last is more of a definite. If you have government expenditure that does increase, if you look at the formula, that does increase aggregate demand, that does lead to more production, which is more demand, and thus it increases your gross national product. According to the accelerator theory, what determines this year's net investment? So the accelerator theory basically posits that this year's net investment is decided by last year's income or last year's aggregate demand, which is somewhat similar to income in this context. And thus, the idea here is if there was more demand or if there was more income which led to more demand in the previous year, in the upcoming year or in this current year, corporations would have made money off of that demand. So they would have money to invest, but they would also, more importantly, have an incentive to invest, because if demand or income is rising, then clearly you need to produce more to satisfy that higher demand or that higher income, which leads to higher demand. Thus, you need to invest in capital goods and you need to invest more to expand your production, to get more machinery and things of that sort. And that's why if last year you had a higher income or higher aggregate demand, this year corporations will be looking to invest a lot more to expand production capacity. So it's not last year's consumption necessarily. So technically, you could make an argument for, I did mention aggregate demand here, but the technicality behind the accelerated theory is it's looking at income. So aggregate demand and overall demand is still relevant, and sure, consumption is a part of aggregate demand, but it's not just consumption. You're just looking at overall the income levels, which are then similar to aggregate demand, but it's a bit of a stretch to call it Consumption. Last year's output as well, it's close, so it can get tricky, but it's not technically correct, because while output is definitely a factor, but the thing you're looking at is national income, because that gives you a more holistic view of what was happening last year, and how much like what how much people want to how much aggregate demand there is, and how much thus you would have to increase production this year, and how much money you made, which is why you can increase production this year and can invest more. Last year's investment is not relevant, it's linked to national income, and thus you would get 2060. Which potential, let's zoom out, which potential diagram shows an economy experiencing an increase in actual output but a decline in potential output? So let's first look at actual output. Your actual output would be the intersection, so the equilibrium point, so the intersection of your aggregate demand curve and your aggregate supply curve. So for example, this is your actual output for year one. In this case, this is your actual output for year two. And they've given you y1 and y2 values to make your life easier. Clearly, actual output is decreasing here. Y2 is less than y1, so it's decreasing here as well. So you can just cross these both out. In both of these cases, actual output is increasing, so we're good to go on the actual output front. What about potential output? So a decrease in potential outputs would mean your long run aggregate supply curve has decreased, so it's shifted towards the left. And that's what's happening here. If you look at it, this is your potential. Well, that's a very squiggly line, but that's your potential. Right, sorry about that. And this is your potential for this year. So your potential is decreasing. Conversely, in option D, you can see that your potential is increasing, and they wanted a decrease in potential, a decline in potential. So option C is your correct option. What is likely to follow if a central bank sets negative interest rates? So the thing you want to be thinking about is what happens when interest rates fall. That should work. But in this case, they fall to a very low level. They fall below zero. And thus, to just give you an example, if you're saving, instead of getting money off of your savings, you'd have to pay the bank just to save. So it'll just be the opposite of what normally happens when you have a positive interest rate. An increase in government revenue, that is, could be the case. That's not necessarily the most likely thing to follow, because I mean, if interest rates decrease, consumption will increase, but whether or not that consumption leads to an increase in government revenue is still unclear. So it's not a fully confirmed thing. And you can probably find something that's more likely, that's more directly linked. I mean, in economics, most things you can make arguments for, and you can make long-winded links, but you have to look at a more direct link for your MCQ paper. An increase in the rate of inflation, and whether that would likely follow. This is still more directly linked, because a decrease in interest rates would naturally cause people to, let me just break this down a little more. If a decrease in interest rates, especially if it's negative interest rates, that's a big decrease, would decrease the incentive to save, because you're not getting any money off of your savings. You're in fact losing money. So you instead just consume a lot more. And consumption increases aggregate demand. You have demand pull inflation. So part B is correct. The reason I didn't go for part A is because government revenue is dependent on so many more factors as well, and this factor is not so clear. So you can try to argue that maybe if consumption increases and aggregate demand increases, who knows, maybe there is income tax and maybe incomes increase, but that's a little more indirect and slightly a bit more of a stretch. You wouldn't really have a reduction in bank lending, because now loans are actually more attractive to people, because if you take a loan, instead of having to pay back a certain amount of in addition as like a 10% interest on top, you would have to pay back less, because now it's a negative 10%, so you just have to pay back 90% of the original loan. So people would love to take loans. That's not something that would be reduced, and you wouldn't have deflation. It's just the opposite of this. And so this, for the same logic, you wouldn't have deflation, you would have inflation. Your consumer price index fell by 3% in the last year, so that is deflation. So your prices are falling. and there was lots of unemployment. It's unacceptably high. So which combination of policies would a government be most likely to adopt in such a circumstance? So you want to essentially in these cases increase aggregate demand, because if you increase aggregate demand, that will lead to more employment, and it might also lead to a bit of inflation, but that's fine because you have deflation and that's causing the problem. So a little bit of inflation in this case, that's acceptable. So your main goal is to increase aggregate demand and stimulate the economy. An appreciation of the currency. Now, whether or not this will increase aggregate demand is uncertain. It could boost your exports, it could decrease your exports depending on the elasticity of exports. So it's usually not the most reliable policy. And increasing interest rate is just contractionary, because increasing interest rate increases the incentive to save because you get more return. So you consume less, because the more of your income is spent in savings. And if you're consuming less, aggregate demand actually decreases, not increases. So that's the opposite of what you want to do. Increasing government expenditure, that's great. That will increase your aggregate demand. But let's look at the second policy because it's a combination of policy. But if you increase taxes, that just leaves less disposable income, so less consumption, less aggregate demand. So this is one bad policy, one good policy in a way, where bad and good is how much they can increase aggregate demand. So let's just put an option here and see if there's another option with where both policies are increasing aggregate demand. Increasing indirect taxes will simply like lead to less supply, so there's more cost of production. So that's just going to be less supply, less production, more unemployment. And again, a depreciation of the exchange rate could improve your aggregate demand, could by increasing exports. If they're elastic, if they're inelastic, they wouldn't improve it. So it's not so clear. And again, taxes just simply won't help with production. Reducing income taxes is great because again, you'll be left with more income because there's less tax, so you can consume more. There's more AD. And a cut in the interest rate helps because interest rates falls, the incentive to save falls. Instead, you consume, so you have more AD. So, and then if you have more AD, you have more, like you slightly improve the deflation rate, so you can normalize that a bit. Maybe have some low and stable inflation, which is what's actually preferable, and that would ensure that you have a incentive to produce. There's more production. Unemployment would be resolved to some extent. So other things being equal, ceteris paribus, what is the most likely to result from an increase in the country's interest rates? So what happens when interest rates increase? Capital inflow is the right answer. What is capital inflow? It's basically money flowing in because your interest rates have increased. So the incentive to save in this particular country has increased because there's more return from it. So foreign investors as well would start placing their money in your country because you have a higher interest rate, so they can earn more return, more money off of it. A depreciation of the currency. If you increase interest rates, you would probably have the opposite, because if you increase interest rates, people would want to save or invest in your country, so they would increase the demand for your, let's suppose, your PKR. They would increase demand, which would actually increase your exchange rate. And similarly, your own investors would probably stop investing in other countries. Some of them might look at the high interest rate and just save within your own economy, and thus supply would also fall of PKR, which is also useful in improving your exchange rate. So if anything, you can expect an appreciation, not a depreciation. And increasing consumption, well, if interest rates increase for the same savings are likely to increase because there's a higher return, so there you have less money to consume. So you don't have an increase in consumption, you have a decrease in consumption. And an increase in investment. Like the layman logic is, interest rates are high, it's harder to get loans, and thus you're just like less likely to take loans and invest because like loans require much more payback in terms of higher interest rates. But the more formal theory, which encapsulated more than just this example, is where you have investments and you have interest rates, and this is your, recall this diagram, marginal efficiency of capital, and you can see there's an inverse relationship. So an increase in interest rates won't increase investment, they would just decrease investment. So the opposite of this. And yeah, we're done with this particular paper. I do think I could have been a little more clear in this explanation. It's a little late, so forgive me for that. But yeah, if anything is unclear, just ask in the comments below and I'll try to clear it up. And if you want me to solve any specific papers, let me know in the comments below as well, and I'll try to get to them. And if you liked the content, hopefully you did. If you're still watching at the end of this very long video, then I assume you liked it. So do like the video, spread the word, subscribe, all of that regular jazz. All right, take care. That'll be it for this video.